Welcome to the Jefferson County Colorado Renewable Energy chapter. We're having a first in a while all online meeting here, and today I titled this talk Coal's Demise and What Comes Next. We have a little bit more technical and instructive title by our presenter, David Hurlbut, The Navajo Generation Station, what its closure teaches about decarbonizing the grid. So before I introduce Dave, I quickly want to alert you to our upcoming events. Our next event within the network of the 5 chapters of the Colorado Renewable Energy Society is on February 22nd. It's a Tuesday, organized by the Northern Colorado chapter. And the title there is Optimizing Energy Storage for Ultra-High Renewable Electricity Systems. And I will put that information into the chat where you can cut and paste it. Now, for the introduction, David Hurlbut is a senior analyst at NREL's Strategic Energy Analysis Center. He specializes in wholesale market design, although this work lies quite a way back in the past, but I'm obviously remember the scandalous breakdown of the ERCOT system last February. Maybe in the Q&A we might be able to ask him a question about that. Dr. Hurlbut is also the author of a 2017 book called Creative Destruction and the Electric Utility of the Future, which explores the socio-economic drivers transforming the power sectors. He's got a doctorate and master's degree from the Lyndon B. Johnson School of Public Affairs at the University of Texas at Austin. We have Dave here tonight because of his role supporting the Bureau of Reclamation on the Navajo Generation Station in Arizona, which used to be the largest coal-fired generation plant in the Western United States until it went poof in late 2019. He'll explain to us why we're seeing coal's demise, how it impacts the Hopi and Navajo nations on those lands, on whose lands and labor it depended, and he'll give us his perspective on what may come next. As for the format, at some point he'll open it up for questions, and that will be somewhere in his talk. So if you would be so kind as to type questions into the chat, into the questions pane as they come to you, and we'll then sort through them and have them answered. There's a second part then after that, interim Q&A, and at the very end we may be opening up the microphone for additional Q&A. There are 2 different timelines floating around. One says we're stopping at 8:30. But well, we might be going longer if there is a ton of questions. So with that, I'm gonna turn off my own webcam and leave it. I'm still sharing it. It seems stop sharing my webcam is what I need to do. Okay. And it's now over to Dave.
Great, thanks a lot, Martin, and thanks for the introduction. And folks, as you can tell, we might be having some technical issues in trying to get this out. So if you have trouble hearing, or if I get frozen and I keep talking and I don't know that I'm frozen, please pop a note into the chat, and we'll try to fix it as quickly as we can. But I appreciate the invitation to speak here tonight. It's following up on a previous talk that I gave to JCRES when I think we were still meeting in person. It was before the pandemic. But a lot has happened since then, and what I'd like to do is to just talk through how everything has transpired and basically take help draw the lessons from what happened with the coal plant. I do want to start with a disclaimer. I'm here basically talking to you all as an individual. I'm not speaking on behalf of the National Renewable Energy Laboratory or the U.S. Department of Energy or God Almighty or anybody. It's basically these voices inside my head. But I also wanted to kind of get into storytelling mode. I mean, this is going to be different from presentations that you might have seen from NREL folks before that are loaded with really dense data charts and tables and everything. I'm not going to have that so much right now because numbers are really only as important as the stories that they tell, and I want to try to get to the story that is really happening in the power sector, of which the Navajo Generating Station was really just one chapter. This talk is going to be lighter on presentation slides than normal because a lot of the storylines here are really best described orally. They don't really lend themselves to terse PowerPoint pictures. So I'm not really going to do that. There aren't very many slides, but there will be a lot of storytelling. So that's something to keep in mind. And I also want to I'm glad Martin mentioned the timeline. When I first thought I was going to be doing this, I thought I was only going to have an hour, which and I kind of tailored all the presentation to that. But some of you may have seen the movie Lincoln, where the president is sitting around a table with his cabinet, and he's talking at length about the dilemma of states' rights, and he concludes by saying, as the preacher said, I could write shorter sermons, but once I start, I get too lazy to stop. I'll do my best not to step into that trap and not to get lazy, because I do want to have some time at the end for discussion. But there is a lot to this story, and hopefully you will find this engaging and interesting, and I really do look forward to the discussion. There are going to be two pieces to this. First, we'll talk mostly about the plant itself, how it came into being, what happened to it, what was going on in the overall power sector that was affecting its viability, and then we'll stop at the end and deal with with any clarifying questions that you all might have. So as this goes on, if there are things that you're not certain about or you would like more information about, just pop it into the chat, and Martin will go through it when we get to that point, and we'll provide as much clarification as we can. And then after that, we'll look specifically at the Navajo and the Hopi and the challenges that they have in transitioning to a post-coal economy in the wake of losing this huge plant that provided so many jobs for tribal members. So, and I'd also like to give a shout out to our hosts. Of course, the Colorado Renewable Energy Society. I'm very grateful for the opportunity to be here with you all tonight. But also to the Green First Task Force of First Universalist Church of Denver. My heart is very much with First Universalist, since my wife is the minister there now. And then also our host, Jefferson Unitarian Church, which Ruth and I are still members. Given the our relationship with these two churches, I thought it would be appropriate just to sort of set the framework by talking about one of the principles of Unitarian Universalism, and that is respect for the interdependent web of existence of which we are all a part. Now, this raises up protection of the environment, protection of the natural environment, honoring the natural environment as value, but it's really more than that. It's more than simply respect for the natural environment. It's also a call to be mindful of the whole picture. So we might look at things and we might want things to be different, and we might work to change them in the way we want, but there are many, many pieces to the picture that are part of this interdependent web. And in this case, the job isn't over when the coal plant is decommissioned. There's a lot more work to be done. What happens to the vulnerable economies of the Navajo and Hopi who depended on the coal plant and the coal mine for paychecks? What tools do they have to craft a new future? What do we use to replace Navajo Generating Station? I mean, it wasn't built because utilities woke up one fine day and said, well, let's build a coal plant on the Navajo reservation. There was a reason for it. What are those reasons as they exist today, and what is the best strategy for meeting that need? These are some of the questions that we have to take into account if we want a really good path forward into a decarbonized grid. The interdependent web also has implications over time, and that's very important here in understanding the story of Navajo Generating Station. Decisions that were made half a century ago have basically shaped habits, they've shaped perceptions, they've shaped conditions that we find today and the options that we have going forward. So that interdependence also speaks to sort of a karmic web of causes and effects, and that means that we today have to be mindful of the future effects of things that we might cause today. All told, what the seventh principle boils down to is that the answers are never simple. I'm always suspicious of simple answers because there are always unintended consequences that you have to be aware of. So that's a big part of this story as well. So let's start with the basics. The Navajo Generating Station was located on the Navajo Reservation in the far northwest corner of the reservation, near Lake Powell. It was built on land leased from the Navajo Nation. Its fuel came from a mine that was about 60 miles to the southeast of the plant, and it was shipped by rail. Cooling water was diverted from Lake Powell. The plant came into existence in the 1960s, the late 1960s, in conjunction with a federal initiative to build an aqueduct from the Colorado River to Phoenix and to Tucson, Arizona. That was a monumental project that was going to need a monumental amount of electricity, more than the existing utilities could accommodate. So the plan was to build a power station that would provide power to the pumps for this plant. And after a significant public outcry, it was realized that probably putting a dam on the Grand Canyon was not the best way to go about it. Instead, the decision was to build a coal plant. Now, at that time, supercritical coal plant technology, which is basically using pressurized water to increase the amount of electricity you can get from a boiler, had reached a point of maturity but it also had a characteristic that that it was more economically efficient the larger the operation was. So there was an economies of scale issue at play that led the federal government to open up participation in this plant to all utilities in the Southwest, to basically supersize the plant, and to not only to provide power for the Central Arizona project, but also to reduce the cost to as much as possible. 5 utilities responded: Salt River Project, which serves the area around Phoenix, Arizona Public Service, Tucson Electric Power, Nevada Power, and the Los Angeles Department of Power and Water. They all had a share of this 2.2 gigawatt Leviathan that was built at the corner of the Navajo Reservation. Salt River Project was the operator, but because the purpose of the plant was to provide power for the pumps of the Central Arizona Project, a share, about 24% of the plant's output was reserved for the U.S. Bureau of Reclamation, which basically dispatched that to the Central Arizona Project. So the United States did not actually own a share of it, but because of the way the plant was chartered, it had a reservation and entitlement to about 24%. Which was, as I said, the reason the plant was conceived in the first place. So in 1969, a 50-year lease was signed with the Navajo Nation, and then construction on the plant began. And that took about 5 years. In 1976, the 3rd unit was completed and came online. And for a number of years, the plant operated just as most coal plants do operate. Then in 2013, it was actually 2011, the Environmental Protection Agency issued a notice of proposed rulemaking that would have required the operators to add new controls on the plant for NOx. This was because the NOx emissions in the vicinity, including the Grand Canyon, were reaching levels that exceeded requirements, and because the Grand Canyon was a special area designated for air quality protection, this triggered the action by the EPA to increase the level of NOx controls. This is where NREL first became involved. As the federal government's main water bureau, the Bureau of Reclamation, found itself in the middle of a storm of controversy with respect to these pollution upgrades. And they basically came to NREL for an objective assessment of what the impacts would be of adding these controls, and how that would affect future operations of the power plant. So they engaged us. We did an analysis of what the cost impacts would be, and that basically led to the EPA, led to a couple of things. It led to settlement negotiations between the owners, and the Navajo Nation, and Environmental Defense and Western Resource Advocates to see if they could find a settlement for future emission controls for the plant. They did come to a settlement. The settlement was presented to EPA and it was accepted by EPA. And so that basically set a timetable for adding selective catalytic reduction NOx controls on all 3 of the NGS units. There was also something else on the horizon. The original lease was only for 50 years, and in 2019, that lease was going to have to be renegotiated. So in 2014, the negotiations began with the Navajo Nation to come up with a new lease. And shortly after that, the United States began an environmental impact statement looking at the environmental impact of a new site lease for that area. About this time, things started to change in the market. Coal started to lose its primacy as the most cost-effective fuel resource. There was also significant decreases in the cost of renewable energy. So a lot of things were changing the generation picture, not only in Arizona, but nationwide. And these all came to a head in 2017 when the owners announced that they were going to close NGS or sell it to another party that would be interested in continuing operation. No buyer was to be found, and so in 2019, November, Navajo Generating Station generated its last megawatt-hour of electricity. It closed, and decommissioning began. So that's the story of Navajo in a nutshell. But as I said, it was part of a bigger story that was happening around this same time. There were a lot of coal retirements taking place from 2017 to 2020, despite a political environment that was supposed to be pro-coal. As it turned out, the amount of coal retirements that took place during this period exceeded the number of coal retirements, the amount of coal retirements during either 4 years of the Obama administration. And that one of the things that this highlights is that, you know, the market can be a powerful ally in the quest for decarbonizing the grid. And working with those economic forces, it's possible to push the transition along faster. Now, the caution is that markets can be a double-edged sword. Just as market forces mitigated in the direction of coal retirements during a period of pro-coal policies, we've actually seen kind of the reverse of that over the past year, where the pace of coal retirements has slowed down. That's due to a couple of reasons. One is that a lot of what was retired over the past 4 to 6 years were relatively easy to retire. There was a clear economic rationale for retiring those plants. Another reason is the price of natural gas. The reason it was so easy to retire coal plants during the previous 6 years is that natural gas was there as a lower cost alternative. So this accelerated the use of natural gas. It made coal easier to retire. A lot of it was retired. But now that natural gas prices have gone higher, then that momentum has slowed a bit. So I don't expect that to continue because natural gas prices are rapidly responsive to supply and demand. Production is going up, the rig counts are going up, prices have come down somewhat, and I would not be surprised at all to see that continue. But specifically, these were the two things that I think were probably the strongest drivers for accelerating coal retirements. As I said, the price of natural gas. In the top graph, you see the trends in natural gas prices as pretty much following along, causing observable results in the use of natural gas as a source of power generation. At the same time, a similar trend was happening with renewables. The prices of wind and solar were declining precipitously from 2009 up to today, and that was causing significant growth, nearly 7-fold in the amount of energy generated from wind and solar from 2009. So both of those factors were sort of filling in the gap that was being left by coal kind of reducing its hold on the market. This is specifically how we map things out for NGS. We did a study that was released on November 8th, 2016. A big part of the analysis was looking at price trends in the wholesale power market for the Southwest, and looking at cost trends for NGS. We had a pretty clear idea of what its operating cost would be and how that would change over time. So with some econometric modeling, we did a similar analysis of what price trends were doing, basically saying, if you just didn't use NGS and you went onto the market to buy power to replace it, what would that power most likely cost? And that this pink band kind of shows the plausible range of wholesale power prices. This chart just shows price projections for peak hours from like 8 in the morning to about 9 at night on weekdays. It does not include hours, off-peak hours like weekends, late at night. That trend, NGS was out of the money pretty much the entire time. So the picture was pretty clear that there was a very high likelihood that the cost of operating the Navajo Generating Station was going to be more expensive than the market was signaling at the time, and that was going to translate into higher electricity costs for all the electricity customers who used NGS power, as well as higher water prices for water customers of the Central Arizona project that used power from the Navajo Generating Station to run those pumps.
Hey, David, can I quickly ask you to spell out what NGS stands for?
Navajo Generating Station.
Okay.
Yeah, sorry about that. That was, yeah, I thought I'd mentioned that earlier, but I guess I didn't. So our analysis was published, as I said, November 8th, 2016, the day after the election. We had strategically planned it that way because we wanted to make sure that everything was defensible, bulletproof, and that we had strategies in place for however things might have changed. And the world changed on that election day, as we all know. But it was still clear from the numbers that the economic viability of the plant was very much in doubt. Our analysis was based entirely on publicly available data. We did not use any proprietary data. We didn't go to SRP and ask them for special data, mostly because we wanted to make sure that our results were replicable by anyone who wanted to reproduce our analysis. However, 4 months after we released our study, the utility owners announced their decision that they were going to exit the plant at the end of the contract, or at the end of the lease with the Navajo tribe. And that was additionally informed by their proprietary data, the data that they had on things like contracts, operating costs, everything that they knew entered into the viability of the plant and what it was going to cost their ratepayers to continue operating the plant. They also had to factor in the cost of new NOx controls beginning in 2025 in accordance with the settlement agreement that had been approved by EPA. The cost of those new controls were one of the things that tipped the scales in favor of closing the plant. Another cost factor that entered into it was the new lease agreement with the Navajo Nation. Now, the tribe had contended for a number of years that that the lease agreement and the terms of that original 50-year lease weren't really equitable to the tribe. It was basically paying the tribe what they argued was a very small amount of money in exchange for very large benefits that the rest of the state was getting from the power generated by that coal plant. So they had come into negotiations with the intent to basically rectify that. And there was actually not much resistance from the utility owners of the plant. They realized that that not only was there a history, but there was an investment in the tribes that that they felt was justified. The Bureau of Reclamation really wanted to build tribal capacity and tribal ability to sort of expand their economic base, and this was at the time it was seen to be kind of a first step in helping the Navajo Nation do that. That all came to a stop when the owners decided that they were going to exit the plant at the end of the 50-year lease in 2019. So I want to stop here, and this is kind of where we go into storytelling mode. So the time between February 2019 or 2017, when the utilities announced that they were exiting the plant, and the time that decommissioning began in November and December of 2017 was a very interesting time to be in the energy analysis business. Now, we were still under contract with the Bureau of Reclamation to provide technical support with respect to 2 tracks affecting or related to the coal plant. One was the economic analysis and the market analysis, the technical analysis about what was going on and what was happening in the market that was affecting both the viability of the Navajo Generating Station itself, as well as options for replacing that power with energy from other sources. So that was one track. The other track was a capacity building activity working directly with the government of the Navajo Nation and the Hopi tribe to help them understand how they could best articulate their interests in the emerging green energy market. And this was very, very important. I mean, there was already perceptions that, well, okay, if the plant goes away, we can just replace it with renewable energy. But you have to be very careful about that. If you have a bunch of privileged white folks coming into the reservation saying we've got a solution for all your problems, we're going to put solar panels all over everything, that's essentially white supremacy dressed in a green suit. The approach we wanted to take was to help the tribes build their own indigenous capacity to articulate their own interests and be in a strong position at the bargaining table when they sat down with developers to talk about locating projects on their land and to basically formulate their own energy policy that they could bring into account in not only participating in the green energy economy, but also engaging in other economic development activities that would help them in a post-coal world. So that was, and we kept both of those tracks fairly quiet because we felt that they were both important, and we didn't want them to be derailed by what was going on in Washington. Part of the strategy was that we worked very, very closely with the field offices in the Bureau of Reclamation, with the Boulder City field office and with the Phoenix field office. And a lot of that support, in fact, our main contact at the end of this said he felt like he should get a graduate degree in power sector economics, because he had basically learned so much. I mean, this guy was a water engineer, and reclamation is full of water engineers. Energy is not really their thing. Electricity is not really their thing. So we basically trained field level staff at reclamation about what was happening in the market. So they were able to take that message up their chain of command. And so when that message got to Washington, it came from reclamation staff and not from the National Renewable Energy Laboratory, which would have run a significant risk of having all the findings basically dismissed out of hand because of the work that NREL does. Having that same information go internally up the chain of reclamation was a very big reason, I think, that the administration decided that they weren't going to engage in any extraordinary activity like subsidies to keep the plant going. They realized that it was going to be an uphill battle economically, and it wasn't us telling that; it was reclamation's own people telling them that. The two strategies that the administration pursued in order to keep the plant open, first was to help find someone that could step in and buy the plant and take it over and continue to run it. It was pretty obvious from the market analysis that we had done that there wasn't going to be anyone coming down the pipe that would be interested in buying that coal plant, even a piece of it. There was a nibble from one entity, and when we kind of looked at their financials and at their history, it was obvious that, or it was apparent that their strategy, if they would have taken over the plant, would have been to basically run the plant into the ground for 2 years and then sell it off for salvage. And it was an open question as to whether or not they would have honored all of the reclamation or the decommissioning obligations, of the plant once they stopped operating it. But that deal never happened. There was no buyer that came forward. The other strategy that the administration pursued that also did not go very far was something similar that you hear to kind of states that are trying to protect their own coal generators. Okay. There is sometimes a nuance or sometimes a message that these states want to force the plants to stay open, and by implication, force utilities to buy power from the plants when in fact they don't want to, or their customers don't want them to, or their own state laws might prohibit them from doing that, as was the case in California. That's why Los Angeles Department of Water and Power got out of Navajo Generating Station. Well, a variation on that strategy that the administration tried was to find some way to force the Central Arizona project to buy power from the Navajo Generating Station. That, after all, was why the plant was created in the first place. Since that time, from 2017 on, the supervising board of the Central Arizona project has been pulling together a portfolio of other energy sources, other sources of electricity to power the pumps of CAP at a much lower cost than would have been the case if they would have continued taking power from NGS. So this portfolio of new power purchase agreements was not only lower cost, but it was also cleaner. It included one, perhaps two solar plants, and other approaches to reduce emissions. So the portfolio that the Central Arizona project had going forward into the future benefited the state of Arizona not only by reduced emissions, but by lower water costs, lower water rates for the users of CAP water. But it was the attorneys within the Department of Interior reached the conclusion that there was no legal basis for doing that, and so that option was really never pursued. So that's what was going on behind the scenes. NREL was providing supporting information and supporting analysis to the reclamation field offices, informing these dialogues, and that that was the course leading up to November 2019 and the closure of the plant. Now, there was also one other aspect to continued efforts to keep the plant open after the utilities had decided they were getting out. That delayed wider efforts to help both the Navajo and Hopi tribes plan for a post-coal economy. At that time, the government of the Navajo Nation was a fairly pro-coal government. They were all behind efforts to try to keep the plant going. The next elections that took place, which I believe were in 2018, 2019, I can't remember exactly. The biggest issue in that tribal election for tribal council, tribal president, was the Navajo Generating Station. As we see all over the country, the opinion was split. The Navajo population itself was split between, should we do everything we can to keep the plant open, or should we just do our best to move on to a future that is cleaner, lower in emissions, and is more consistent with our traditional values. So that was the biggest issue in that election. The winners in that election were primarily the group that wanted to move past coal and get to a cleaner, more sustainable economy and policies that were more consistent with tribal values. But because of the prior efforts, they really lost 2 years to prepare for the coal transition. So once the new administration took over, they basically had a very short timeline, a lot to accomplish in a very short period of time with a lot of consequences. And then COVID hit. So that was that basically stopped everything in it. That all the new administration's efforts were all stopped in its tracks because, as many of you may know, it was the tribes that were hit particularly bad by the first wave of COVID. Navajo and Hopi were no exceptions. In fact, they got hit particularly hard. So they just didn't have the bandwidth to kind of follow through on a lot of the early transitional planning that they had done. So that's kind of that's the backstory, kind of taking us everything from the late 60s up to where we are today, to 2019 in the closure. So what I'd like to do is to stop now, and Martin, if you could read any questions that are in the chat box, like we can talk about those.
Yeah, one question that I have here is somebody is curious to hear more about how the tribes made decisions. Was that a consensus process or through designated leaders?
I'm going to talk about that in our next segment.
Okay.
That is a very complicated issue and is something that is shaping kind of the transition to a clean energy economy. Very good question, but I want to, yeah, we'll have more to talk about on that in a moment.
Okay. The other question is, you mentioned possible lower water cost was one alternative to the coal plant. And the question is that because a coal plant uses a lot of water for cooling and puts price pressure on the remaining water in the Lake Powell system? Could you explain that?
No, that's another very, very good question. I mean, water is always an interesting thing in the West. I think they say, whiskey's for drinking, water's for fighting. And the Colorado River is certainly no exception. So there are two water issues related to the Navajo Generating Station. One was resolved fairly easily. The Navajo Generating Station, like any coal plant, needs water for cooling, or it needed water for cooling. And that water came directly out of Lake Powell, and there was a particular entitlement to that water that was earmarked for the coal plant. But the operator of the coal plant, SRP, was open to negotiations about turning those water entitlements over to the Navajo Nation. Now that was subject to, anytime you start talking about the disposition of water rights, that gets into very, very murky legal areas. So I was certainly nowhere close to any of those negotiations. I just know that they were taking place, and I'm not even sure how they were resolved. But at least all the parties were at the table. But that really wasn't the biggest water issue related to the Navajo Generating Station. Remember that 24% of the power plant's electricity was earmarked for the Central Arizona project, and the project used that electricity to basically run the water pumps to pull water, Arizona's entitlement to the Colorado River uphill, just away near the Colorado River banks, and then start moving it across the desert to Phoenix and then down to Tucson. So that takes a lot of electricity, and if that electricity is expensive, then that electricity goes into the water rates that all users of CAP water have to pay. Because it worked out that CAP was able to replace Navajo Generating Station with this alternative portfolio of electricity power, of electricity from other power sources, they were able to avoid increasing the cost of power that would have gone into the rates that water customers would have paid. So that's what I meant by that reference.
Okay, and there's just another question coming in from Tom Abood, who you know well. High Country News did a nice article on the NGS closure in its February 2021 edition with
Yes.
lots of statistics as to water consumption, the politics, etc. So that's a year back. And
yes, an excellent article.
I'll put that in the chat also. And this next question is probably for your next segment, but I'll read it anyway. I've been to the area and learned that the tribes receive free coal for home heating because it does get cold at times. Is there anything to replace that? But as I said, this might be for the second session.
Yeah, in fact, let's just use that as a segue to get into the second session. So we'll come back into it in a minute. This is an example of some of the analysis that we did in the follow-up work, during, from 2017 to 2019. As I said earlier, one of the things that is really driving the transition from coal, at least from 2015 to until last year, was low natural gas prices. So we did an analysis looking at what would happen if you were to just eliminate NGS, just take the number of terawatt hours or gigawatt hours that came from that plant, subtracted it, and then replaced it with the most cost-effective spare capacity on existing combined cycle natural gas generators. And as it turned out, there was plenty of spare capacity. No plant was operated in excess of 60% capacity factor, so plenty of spare capacity. So we had data on the cost of Navajo Generating Station, the cost of these combined cycle units, and it was a fairly easy matter just to swap out those megawatt hours theoretically and look at what they would cost and then compare the total from one year to the next. And as it turned out, if Arizona had replaced NGS with this spare capacity, it would have saved on average about $25 million per year going on to customer bills. Now, looking at 2020, which was the first year of actual post-NGS operations, there actually was a drop in customer rates by about 1%. There actually was an increase in the capacity factor of combined cycle gas plants. So basically, what we had estimated, when we were providing that information to field level staff at Reclamation, is basically what turned out to be the case. So that was kind of an example of the analysis that that was informing those internal decisions going up the line. So I spoke at the beginning of decisions made in the past affecting conditions today, and these conditions affecting the decisions and the options we have today. Some of the benefits that tribal members got, particularly Hopi tribe, was free coal for heating. But when you have an operation the size of the Kayenta mine, I mean, that's a trivial cost of doing business. But there were also ancillary effects to that. The families that used coal for cooking and for heating their homes, there was also a much higher rate of lung disease and related health effects like that. There are other effects. The mine operations affected the groundwater for both the Navajo and the Hopi tribe. Some of the aquifers were not usable in the years after mining began. One aspect of the whole deal with Navajo Generating Station that I didn't mention, that I forgot to mention, is that all of that electricity left the reservation. None of it stayed with the Navajo Tribal Utility Authority. None of it stayed with the Hopi tribe. And both of those tribes have some of the lowest rates of electrification of any part of the country. Now, part of this is that there are a lot of families who just don't want to connect to the grid. I mean, that's definitely a thing. But the ability of families who do want to connect is limited by infrastructure. The cost of delivering power is very high because I mean, the Navajo reservation is expansive. getting distribution lines strung over that sort of a distance is very, very expensive. So you had that as well. So a lot of things affecting the lifestyle of the Navajo people and the Hopi people that in many cases were shaped by the operations of the coal plant and its disposition and the mining operations itself. But the utilities, Salt River Project, the operator of the plant, because once they made their decision in 2017, it was pretty clear from the analysis that we were providing to reclamation's field offices, the utilities were not going to change their mind. And that was pretty much understood on the ground and in Arizona. And so even though the administration might not have been working towards a transition, the utility was. So they did this a number of ways. First, they offered transfers. Younger workers who wanted to stay with the company had the option to transfer to other power plants that were continuing to operate either by Salt River Project, APS, or other partner utilities. Older workers were eligible for early retirement, and those benefits were factored into the cost of retiring the plant. And the utilities also offered job training and severance packages for others who weren't able to take any other option. The upshot was that by the time the plant closed in November 2019, the plant was being entirely run by contract workers and a few supervisors. So all of the permanent employees had either been relocated, had taken retirement, or had gotten a severance package and training for other jobs. So that mitigated the immediate employment impact of closing the plant. In addition, as I mentioned, NREL has been working with the tribes to build capacity so they can negotiate with renewable energy developers. And because as some of you may know, developing a solar plant is not an easy thing. There are a lot of costs that you have to take into account into the pro forma. And one of the difficulties in siting a plant on the reservation is that there was no clear point of contact with the tribal government to figure out critical issues like what taxes would the plant have to pay. The tribe itself didn't know that answer, and that was one of the things that we helped them figure out, was to figure out their own policies so that they could answer that question. Another particular problem, which we'll talk about in a bit, is that particularly with the Navajo Nation, there is the central government, and then there are also chapters, local chapters, that really have a lot of authority. And one of the most important factors that goes into the decision to develop, say, a solar plant or a wind plant is site access. You have to be able to get equipment into the site that you want to develop. You have to be able to put in a gen tie, a connecting line from the plant to the nearest transmission line. You need to have assurance that you will have free access to that site once it's selected. And it wasn't clear who could provide that site access. And because of that complication, it was often much easier for a solar developer or a wind developer to just go a few miles down the transmission line to Rancher Billy Bob and negotiate a deal with him, because all the land use laws were known. It was easy to negotiate a site access deal. All the questions were clearer. So those were the types of issues that we worked with both tribes to figure out how they could get a handle on it. I mean, they still had to pursue their own interests and to advocate for their own interests, but there were also the realities of project development. So if they wanted that clean energy development to happen on their lands, they needed to have some understanding of how it worked. So that's what we worked with them to understand. We also worked with them on expanding their economies. One of the themes that we talked with them about a lot, and which I think they understood fairly clearly, is that they might want to rethink replacing reliance on a large industry with another large industry. And we've seen this story of extractive industries all over the Western United States. It's really, really risky when you have an entire community built on one industry. One of the things we worked with the tribes on was to look at economic diversification, what other industries could be brought in, and they've actually had some progress on that. About a month ago, there was an announcement that a sustainable manufactured home company was going to open up a manufacturing plant on the site of the old Navajo Generating Station, and it's going to bring in maybe 100, 150 jobs, basically at the same site that the plant used to be. So,
quick question about that. That site is completely raised. Is that correct? I mean, there's the plant is totally gone. There's no buildings left and not even a fence.
well, part of it is. I mean, I think there is a fence around areas that are still. I mean, part of it has to be reclaimed, especially because there was a site where they would just basically pile the coal that they were going to be putting onto the conveyor belt and taking into the boilers immediately. So you can't just open that up and let anyone build anything on it they want. That needs to have some revegetation and some special reclamation there. Other parts of the site have been quicker to reclaim. I don't think it has been completely raised. I think there might be some salvage that they're still having to dispose of. But I haven't been to the site myself recently, so I really don't know. But I do know that there were different issues at different parts of the site.
Okay, and also maybe now would be a good time to talk about how the tribes make decisions.
Yeah, and I was getting to that because they're both. Well, the chapter governments are very, very jealous of their jurisdictional space. Okay, and one of the most important things that these chapter councils take care of is grazing rights. Okay, grazing is a very, very big thing. And chapters do operate by consensus, and I'm speaking as an outsider. There are nuances that I don't understand, that I will never understand, but their decision processes sort of proceed at their own pace, and I think that's how it has to be. There are the decision processes within a chapter where they resolve issues of grazing rights, local issues, and you have to have the buy-in of the chapter in order to guarantee any site access. So that has been where that question comes to roost. The question of any tax revenues, that starts out as an issue for the central government of the Navajo Nation, but because there's also an impact for for the chapter, that's one of the questions that the chapter and the central government have to resolve between themselves. And there's not much the developer can do to influence the pace of those negotiations. That's something that the tribal members themselves at those two levels have to work out. So, it is challenging. It is very complicated, but it's something that has to be respected if there's going to be, any, steel on the ground, panels in the air, turbines in the air, and clean power production. Did that get to it, Martin, do you think?
Yeah.
Okay, so I want to touch on a couple of other things here. Even though the plant is gone, the plant was served by some high voltage transmission. These are basically transmission superhighways that carried electricity generated by coal to Las Vegas, to Phoenix, and to Los Angeles. And these high volume, high voltage power lines are still there. Now, a good part of the story is that if you look at solar resources and the quality of solar resources and where that transmission is, the Navajo Nation and the Hopi tribe are situated very, very well, just with respect to the quality of the resources that they have. And the fact that there is high volume transmission already there that is now vacant, that has opened up basically nearly 2 gigawatts of availability for wind and solar power without building any new transmission. That's a big deal, and that is a high value proposition. In the lease negotiations, when it was clear that the Central Arizona project was going to go somewhere else for its power, that basically freed up some capacity on that transmission line, that transmission system, 4 years ago. So Reclamation entered into an agreement by which it assigned to the Navajo Nation 500 megawatts of capacity on that system, corresponding to the power that Central Arizona project wasn't going to be taking anymore from the Navajo Generating Station. So the tribe has basically that transmission rights to that transmission capacity in their hands that they can use in their negotiations with potential developers. But again, that, as I said before, that doesn't simplify the tribal decision-making processes that still have to be observed. So it's still a challenge to figure out how to move things forward. Now, projects have been proposed. They are going through pro formas, and they're cited with clear access to the transmission line. And this is an example. So I want to kind of walk you through this map here. This is the western side of the Navajo reservation. The red line shows the transmission line from the Navajo Generating Station going down to Phoenix. Moenkopi Switch is an existing substation, so this could be an easy intertie for connecting wind resources. You see Gray Mountain. That's one of the best wind areas in the state of Arizona, along with solar that could be sited very, very close. But the Cameron chapter has a very, very strong say in what sites are available for development, taking into account the grazing rights that I mentioned before. There's also the Coal Mine Mesa chapter, the Botaway chapter. Another complication for the Hopi tribe is that there's a part of the Hopi reservation that is really, really close to Moenkopi Switch. But in order to get anything to that substation, the connection lines have to go across Navajo territory. And land access, land issues between the Navajo and the Hopi have been historically stressed, to say the least. That I think has tapered off a bit, particularly with the loss of Navajo Generating Station and the Kayenta mine. I think they both realize that their fortunes are tied to one another. But still, that is an issue for solar development on the Hopi reservation. But this is, this is what the lay of the land looks like with respect to the future of clean energy development for both of these tribes. With that, I think I will stop. Let me just kind of go through kind of my my closing thoughts. So, I've been talking a lot about the background and the history, and I've been trying to make this more like a story. It's not just what I've seen with respect to this particular coal plant. Personally, I put it in the context of everything that I've seen during my 15 years at NREL, during my 6 years with the Texas Public Utilities Commission, working with wholesale markets and developing the Texas renewable energy policy there. And these are just kind of my takeaways that I'm just going to put them out there, take them as you will. But I think at some point we have to start thinking strategically. Certainly we want to see a 100% renewable energy future, but we need to think strategically as to how we are going to get there. Part of that strategy can be using market forces as an ally. That proved to be a very effective ally with respect to the Navajo Generating Station. But as I said, that's not a simple matter. You have to remember that the market forces can be a double-edged sword. We're seeing that right now. Closing a coal plant has human costs. It has very real human costs. So it's not just, unplug the coal plant and we're done. We'll go away and celebrate. These human costs can be mitigated. And Colorado is a very good example of incorporating those human costs, those local costs, into an economic transition plan for transitioning to a post-coal economy locally.
Can I interject a question here
Sure.
from Claire Shemida? And she's asking how many tribal members are actually in that region, because that obviously affects the size of that transition.
Yeah, and unfortunately, I don't know how many thousand off the top of my head actually reside on the reservation. It's a huge reservation. But I mean, that's a good question because it kind of highlights the economic issue here. The plant itself employed about 500 full-time workers, and about 86% were Navajo tribal members. And these were high-paying jobs. In many cases, they were union jobs. So the workers at these plants brought home big paychecks. Well, the Navajo culture is very family-oriented. So if you have one, family member that's bringing in a really healthy paycheck, that gets distributed through that family network pretty extensively. So there's an indirect economic impact of those high-wage jobs that are also affected when those jobs go away. And that's a challenge for that economic transition plan. So the tribe has thousands of members, very high unemployment. Economic analysis that we did indicated that the immediate economic impacts of closing the plant were really going to be felt very heavily with the Navajo and Hopi tribes themselves. But I think there is an awareness that they don't want to make that mistake again. They do, and I think there is an awareness now that something like an extractive industry, a single extractive industry like the Navajo Generating Station, can over decades turn into an economic narcotic that that brings prosperity of a kind, but also has impacts on society that go beyond the paychecks. So that's why the tribes are really focusing on more diversification, economic diversification as part of their post-coal strategy. That's a long answer to the question, but we are talking about in the case of Navajo, thousands of tribal members on the reservation and more if you include the Hopi. Okay. Yeah, let me quickly. Yeah, go ahead, Martin.
Yeah, go to your next point.
Okay. Yeah, I just want to quickly wrap up here, and then we'll just open it up for more discussion. Postponing the transition is a terrible idea. It's only going to make the transition harder. If you have less time to prepare for the change, the harder that change is going to be. And I think that's one of the things that both the Navajo and the Hopi tribes are suffering today, is the desire to deny that the change was coming, and so they put off starting to plan. Natural gas has a place in this transition. I mean, I know everyone talks about going to 100% clean energy grid, and that's all fine and dandy. The fact of the matter is, we've looked at this from a modeling perspective. We know what 80% looks like. We don't know what 100% looks like, because it relies on technologies that have not yet been developed, and it relies on a level of deployment of new technologies that are just now entering the market that is really hard to put that into a model. So we literally don't know what it looked like. We know what it could look like, but in the meantime, there is some complementarity between wind and solar and natural gas, because even though wind and solar might be intermittent, they can be forecasted over a 24, 48-hour period with a reasonably good likelihood of getting that forecast right. That helps in determining what other flexible units you need to have available to meet whatever gap there might be between your renewable fleet and what load is going to require. Natural gas has a natural flexibility that coal never had. So it's easy to take a natural gas plant and run it at kind of a low capacity factor and just run it when you need it to fill in those gaps. Another attribute of natural gas generation that's different from coal is that it's going to be easier to retire a natural gas plant than it will be a coal plant. An example, in the late 1990s, the early 2000s, there was a lot of merchant generation that came online. Generation that wasn't funded by a utility, but was basically a business proposition. That was all natural gas. You never saw any coal. The reason was coal is a terrible investment. The only reason we have so much coal on the system today is because those investments were subsidized by ratepayers through rate base, which is another conversation, but it's basically baking the capital costs of those plants into rates that are paid by a captured customer base. So without that mechanism, the investments in coal plants just would never have made any sense, and they would not have happened. Natural gas is different. It's easier to put the burden on the private sector, and we've already seen that happen. When natural gas plants retire, plants that are owned by a private developer or the private sector, it's the shareholders who make up the cost of of retiring that plant. So that's an easier burden on ratepayers, retiring natural gas. So just speaking for myself personally and nobody else, it does not give me heartburn to see natural gas as part of this transition, with the emphasis on transition. It's not, I think going forward, we definitely need to get away from it, and I think we can. But if you replace 100 megawatt hours that came from coal with 100 megawatt hours from a combination of natural gas and renewables, you've reduced emissions by 75%, and that's that's pretty good for today, and it's a good starting point for further improvements tomorrow. Finally, the transition is not a megawatt for megawatt replacement. One of the things that we emphasized early on is that, even though Navajo Generating Station was 2.2 gigawatts, you're not going to replace that with 2.2 gigawatts of something else. You're going to replace it with a smarter grid, and that means better use of the resources that you have, getting customers to participate as demand response so that they can unlock new sources of value, adding flexibility to the grid so it can accommodate higher penetrations of renewables. And all of those things are possible today. There's no need to wait for any new technology. New technology is going to kind of push the envelope further, but all these things we can do today. And then the last thought I wanted to leave you with is what I like to call Voltaire's axiom: never make the perfect the enemy of the good, because that leads to failure, and failure is not an option. So with that, I think I'll stop and we will open it up to questions.
Well, thank you very much, David, for that presentation, especially also these summary points. I'll go into the questions now. And in terms of your last point with Voltaire, I have a question here from David Alley, and he asks, why is nothing being said about battery and other storage as alternatives to gas?
Well, a lot's being said about it. And in fact, if you look at California, Texas, and New York, California and Texas are particularly interesting because of the pace of renewable expansion in both of those states. Texas is, of course, another conversation. We won't really go into how that came about in a place that is politically hostile to renewables. It's been fairly robust. But over the past 2 years, there's been a very strong expansion of both utility scale PV and battery storage. Some battery storage hybrid with the PV, but also some battery storage, kind of in separate nodes on the grid. So, storage is coming along, and it's making an impact. And we've, I think we've made a lot of progress in figuring out how to incorporate battery storage into the system modeling that we do at NREL, looking at high renewable energy penetrations, and that definitely adds a lot of value to wind and solar by reducing the spilled energy due to overproduction during times of low demand. It also opens up opportunities for co-production. For example, co-production with hydrogen during times when demand is low, prices are low, but you still have a lot of wind power or solar power on the grid. So a lot is happening. I just haven't talked a lot about it here in this point because that's part of kind of that future picture that we're looking at. But I do want to say one other thing in connection to that question. There is no one silver bullet that's going to solve everything. We need storage. We need wind. We need solar. We need hydrogen. We need flexibility, and that flexibility we need it in volumes that require getting it from a number of sources, batteries being one, demand response being another, energy efficiency being another. So there are many arrows in the quiver, and we're going to need to use all of them, I think.
Okay, and I have a numerical question here, so to speak. What is the apples to oranges comparison in coal pollution versus natural gas pollution? I think you
Roughly,
touched it a little bit,
with respect to NOx, with respect to carbon emissions, it's roughly 2 to 1. 1 megawatt-hour of from coal is about, I think, gosh, okay, so my I think 1,000 tons. It's about 500 tons from natural gas. And forgive me if I've gotten my decimal places wrong. I sometimes get the conversions wrong, but it's roughly, natural gas is like half of the carbon emissions of coal on a per megawatt hour basis.
Yeah, but as you mentioned, there are other pollutants, and those pollutants might not happen at all when you burn gas.
Some. So you're still going to have some NOx. Whether you have sulfur dioxide depends on the quality of the natural gas as well as the quality of the coal. Coal with high sulfur content will have high SO2 emissions. But yeah.
Okay.
And John Steele, thank you for that information on tribal population.
Yeah, I popped that into the chat. Tom has another question. He says, from where does the Central Arizona project now obtain the electricity it needs to move the Colorado River water through pumps? It sounds like a significant amount of electricity is required.
Yeah, and okay, I'm trying to reconstruct this from memory because this was it's been a couple of years since I've tuned into it, but I believe they entered into a special contract with the Salt River Project that where basically SRP was pricing its system power favorably, and that included dedicated power from at least one PV plant. There was actually a solicitation for PV plants that would serve the CAP that we included in this portfolio. And unfortunately, a project that was going to be located on the Hopi reservation came in second. They put together a pretty good proposal, but apparently there was another one that came in at lower cost. So that was the one that went. But that does suggest that the tribes are figuring out how to get into the clean energy game. So even though they didn't get that particular contract, they were pretty competitive. So that, in my mind, is really, really good news. So it's basically coming from a portfolio through Salt River Project.
David Olson asks, what is the status of solar and wind development on the RES? And I would like to add, you mentioned that one chapter on Gray Mountain had issues with grazing rights, and that surprised me a little because we all know that in Texas or Nebraska, ranchers love wind power because it does not limit their cattle grazing at all and gives them revenue.
Right. I mean, again, it's something that the chapters have to arbitrate. That's really where the authority for that sort of thing lies. Gray Mountain was an interesting case. It had the prospects to be a pretty good wind development. The site was really good. They had anemometers, providing some pretty good data on it. But there was a conflict. The chapter and the central government were not on the same page. They weren't even talking to the same people. So there were two developers that were interested in putting wind plants on Gray Mountain. One was talking primarily with the chapter, the other one was talking primarily with the central government. And because those two levels of government couldn't get on the same page, both of those developers ended up going somewhere else because they could, when you have capital to develop a wind project, you can keep that capital on hold only for so long. So they moved on to another project. So that was kind of the story there. There has not been, there's been the data for wind development in that area, but to my knowledge, there's been no new interest in that area. Now, with respect to solar development on the reservation, it's a similar story. Solar development is more sensitive to grazing rights than wind is. Gray Mountain was like up, on the mountain, so so there were still grazing issues there, but for that wind project, it was really more the lack of coordination between the chapter and the central government. Grazing rights are a significant thing for PV projects, and that's one reason that progress in that Cameron area, area near the Moenkopi switch that I mentioned, has been so slow because of figuring out what to do with the grazing rights. There have been proposals to do large solar projects close to the old Navajo Generating Station site, which has an advantage because it could tie into the substation that the coal plant used to have. So again, easy access. But I'm not sure where that is. And when I first saw that interconnection request pop up in APS's interconnection queue, I was wondering whether or not that was a real project or whether or not it was a developer just trying to put a stake in the ground to keep somebody else from getting there first. There have been tentative plans announced for that site, but as of last I know, there has been no power purchase agreement signed. Now, the Navajo Nation has its own tribal utility authority, and they made an early foray into the solar project, and that's what we're looking at right now in this slide. This is the Kayenta solar project owned by the Navajo Tribal Utility Authority. They had been trying to find an off-taker for the power from this plant, but their timing was fairly unfortunate because you think about what happens with, well, okay, solar prices have been coming down, very rapidly, and the Navajo Tribal Utility Authority built this plant kind of on the leading edge of that price decline trajectory. So soon after this project came online, you were seeing projects all over the Southwest that were coming in at a very, very low levelized cost of energy, and were securing power purchase agreements for very low cost, much lower than NTUA was able to get for what it was offering for its project. So the project is going into NTUA's own grid and serving its own customers, but it does have this cost. But they did gain some valuable experience. We took a team of solar development experts out to this very project and did a walkthrough with some of their engineers and looked at things that could have been done better, things that were done well, and kind of looking at it from a developer's eye. So if the authority wants to do something like this again, they are definitely going to be in a much better informed position to make something happen. But that's about it so far.
I also have a question here about transmission losses. How small or big are transmission losses, and isn't there a danger that some of these solar projects could be moved closer to Phoenix and thereby be more effective?
Yeah, well, these are 500 kV lines. So the transmission losses on those lines are fairly small, even if they're AC lines. Where you really see the biggest losses, and this is what I think would be more of a risk the closer you get to Phoenix, when the only available interconnections are like say 230 kV or 345 kV, those are lower voltages. They have higher loss rates. So that's another reason that proximity to this 500 kV line is a really strong selling point for the Navajo tribe if they can get past all of the other issues that they need in negotiating with developers.
Okay, one question I have here from David Alley. I think it's been partially answered, but I'll repeat it. Has NREL advised the tribes about the potential for distributed solar to increase chapter and individual electrification?
Yes, actually, we've been doing that not only with Navajo, but with a lot of other tribes for a number of years. Distributed resources, rooftop solar, and that sort of support. There's a separate program for that through DOE's Office of Indian Energy. So yeah, and that's ongoing support.
The follow-up question on that from David Alley is, what about microgrids? Are they part of that that planning or advising?
That was something that we looked at for the Hopi tribe, and that was very interesting, because there are a number of reasons that you use microgrids. I mean, they're used a lot in Alaska. They're very valuable in Alaska because so many areas are isolated from the rest of the grid. You have so many, islands and remote areas that, I mean, microgrids are, in some cases the only option. That's not really the case here. The Hopi tribe asked us about that, and we did some simulations and looking at the cost of sort of establishing a microgrid that would support kind of a new tribal operating building. And we compared that with the cost of basically running an extension line to the Navajo Tribal Utility Authority and just, interconnecting with their existing distribution system rather than a microgrid. And as it turned out, it was less costly to do that than to do the microgrid, because for the microgrid, you have to have, a lot of power controls. You need to have some, some storage capability, some way to sort of balance the load with the generation that you're getting from the PV plant. So there's more controls, there are more devices that you need to include in microgrid. So that's been looked at. It could be revisited, under the right circumstances. But at least they've gone through the exercise, so they understand what a microgrid is and where it can be useful.
Okay, and I have a question that I'm finding a little hard to parse from Lynn Siegel. So I put it in the chat, and she basically asks about the diversity of jobs with demand response, transactive energy, and microbit grids with batteries. Could you compare these opportunities with distributive versus transmission renewable energy?
I definitely would not want to hold up transmission to wait for this to come along. Ideally, you're going to have both, and that's the same story anywhere.
Okay.
You optimize transmission to the point that you need bulk transfer capabilities, but for the flexibility and operability, the demand response is very, very important. Batteries are important, and that's kind of the cutting edge of power system economics right now, is figuring out how to structure economic incentives for end use customers so they can participate in what is effectively a wholesale transaction, but to do that in an aggregated way so that this aggregated customer level response has the most value that can then be redistributed to the participating members. So, it's a very interesting and exciting area. And at some point, that could be helpful for the Navajo and Hopi tribes. But that depends on developing the capacity of the Navajo Tribal Utility Authority and the Hopi Utility Authority. The Hopi Utility Authority is just getting its feet. They just got chartered fairly recently, and so they're and they landed a grant from the Commerce Department to begin developing. So that's a very positive thing, I think. But you have to be aware of where the tribe is and in its willingness to assimilate these new options. Okay, it's a bad idea to helicopter onto the reservation and say, we have this answer for you, just go do it. It's a lengthy process, it's a capacity building process, and it's like anything else that happens in the Navajo culture. You give it the time that it's due. You let it come to light and you let it grow naturally. So, yeah.
Yeah. On that note, I think I want to close out by, I mean, my accent is Germany. That's where I'm from. I'm actually originally from a coal-producing region before I moved to the Swiss border. But there, the people knew a long, long time ago that the era of coal was going to come to an end. And they started decades ago to think about a transition away from that dependency, because that's what it was. There was an entire region that was completely dependent on coal mining and production and steel.
Mm-hmm.
But they started this process early and branched out and had a fairly soft landing. And I think that would be a lesson uh, for energy transitions in general, to anticipate and not to deny that change is coming, whether you want it or not. And I think with that, I'll end this webinar. We're closing in on 2 hours, which is a bit lengthy. So I'm thanking all of you who participated and stayed. And if you take one last look at the chat, I put in again our upcoming event with the Northern Colorado chapter for February 22nd. And if you quickly cut and paste this or get onto our meetup, you'll be reminded that this is coming up. So thanks again, David Hurlbut, and have a good night.
Thank you all, and it was a pleasure to be here, and look forward to chatting further soon.